let's look at some mosses that we're going to see hopefully in the field, or at least pictures of them in the next few minutes. And recall, please, that mosses have different growth forms. Kind of like the way trees and shrubs are growth forms for those pushy vascular plants, those bullies of the plant kingdom. Mosses can be thought of as having two general growth forms. Acrocarps that are upright and have their sporophytes at the very tip, and pleurocarps that are laying flat, more or less, and branched, and the sporophytes are where the branch axils are. These are sort of rough categories. Actually, pleurocarps are a clade, a natural group, and acrocarps are a little more widely dispersed. Here's a picture of an acrocarp with its upright sporophytes, and they're kind of short, but they're upright stems too. And here's a pleurocarp. So, in order to get some handle on bryology with the almost 400 species in Ohio, we can use leaf shape, presence or absence of a midvein or costa. Remember that a moss leaf may or may not have a midvein that's called a costa, and it's not a vein. It never was a vein because it's not vascular, but mid-nerve, sometimes it's called. And a few families that I sometimes call weird ones because their structures are so different. The ones that are strictly flat, which is mostly the genus Physidens. The Polytrichaceae is very different. It's got leaves that are, well, you'll see. And Sphagnum, which is in a different order, actually, than most other mosses. And then we can look at some of the common mosses in each one of these sort of rough categories. So let's take a look at acrocarps with hair-like leaves. And I've selected some that I think are common ones you're more likely to encounter than others, but I have a more exhaustive list for the idea of being able to choose from them and check some other sources. So the ones with asterisks are the ones that are going to be described here, not in the order they're shown necessarily. This is called Bartramia pomiformis. Pomiformis means apple form, because the sporophytes are very round, kind of like apples, and there's needle-like leaves. It grows on sandstone, typically, and damp, shady cliffs. It's a beautiful moss. There's a very well-known moss, very common one, called Broome Moss, Dicranum scoparium, and is often seen in sort of bare patches in woodlands and occasionally on cliffs. And it has leaves that are secund. They're swept to one side as if there's a strong prevailing wind, or kind of like a broom. And I'm having fun drawing this. Go on, move on. Here's that genus Dicranum has a number of members in it that have hair-like leaves. This is a boulder in Delaware County, Ohio, and it's got a lichen and a moss on it. What I'd like to show you is the lichen and the moss. The lichen, by the way, is a crustose lichen called smoky-eyed boulder lichen, but the focus of our attention now is the moss, and it's a kind of dicranum. It's a Dicranum fulvum, and one of the best ways to recognize it is by substrate. It tends to be a boulder or cliff moss, very dark, kind of looks like hair. Bare soil sometimes has mosses growing on it, short-lived mosses that are typically annuals. Here's one with very, very narrow leaves. It's very light green. It almost looks like, it has such abundant sporophytes that it almost looks like grass growing on the ground. And it's called Ditricum pallidum. Here's something that's easy to mistake Ditricum for, and it's another one. It's called Dyke Rinella. Dyke Rinella, the ella suffix means kind of a little version of what comes before. And so this is like a diminutive dicranum. It's smaller than the Broome Moss is, and it has more upright sporophytes. And it's common on bare soil. You find it along paths and woodlands. So let's take a look at acrocarps with narrow but not what you would call hair-shaped leaves. And we have a couple of these set apart. There's several more that we could have included, and maybe you'll see them in your studies. This is a moss called claw moss, Barbula unguiculata, and it's fairly common, very common even, on like agricultural land that's been fallow, and sidewalk paths, on typically calcareous soil. It has a nice sort of a light green color that's a consequence of the leaf cells actually being minutely bumpy. And here's a closer up of it. And what's noteworthy about Barbula unguiculata is that the leaf tips have a little claw. The costa, the mid-nerve, extends to past the tip of the leaf as a little, what's called an apiculus. And that's why it's called claw moss, and that makes it a little easier to recognize than it might otherwise be. Here are the sporophytes of claw moss. When they're young, when they're a little older, they have an amazing peristome. It's like 32 twisted hair-like teeth. Amazing peristome. This is one of the most distinctive mosses, and the one that we're looking at is the one on the ground here. I mean the lower one. It's called leucobrium, which, if you look at the word, leuco means white and brium means moss, and it is a whitish moss. It has this ghostly bleached look. And that's because, unlike most mosses, which are only one cell thick, this little cross-section of the leaf in the lower left shows that there's actually a thin layer of green cells, photosynthetic cells, in the middle, and then flanking it are one or two layers, I should say, of hollow, empty, dead cells. So it gives it a puffy kind of ghostly aspect. And it's sometimes called pincushion moss because it grows in these little mounds that resemble something you'd put a pin in. Put a pin in that. By the way, growing with this is some haircap moss, polytrichum. They kind of grow together a lot on open, barren sites. They're friends. Some mosses grow on trees. A good substrate for mosses is the bark of trees. Not too many grow super high up, and this is one of the ones that does. It's called bristle moss. There are several species. They're kind of hard to tell apart. I think this one is the one that's called Orthotrichum pusillum, and this is one of the mosses that has a sessile sporophyte. In other words, there's not much of a stalk. It's in there someplace, but it's minuscule. It's essentially stalkless, and the capsule, the sporangium, is embraced by the uppermost leaves. Probably because, it's already elevated because it's on a tree, so that moss doesn't need to go to any great lengths to elevate the sporangia even further. This is a little insider baseball, but by the way, moss sporophytes have stomates, breathing pores, like the leaves of higher plants do. And they're usually not of particular interest, but in this genus Orthotrichum, the bristle mosses, the stomates are actually one of the features and the keys for telling the species apart. And so we have a reason to look at the stomates. Here's a close-up of the stomate. What's special about it is it's sunken into a little pit. You have to look down through these little cells in the top. And that's a fun thing to look at through a microscope. Here's a little Acrocarp. And again, this light color, this light green color, sometimes this is attributable to a moss having minute little bumps on the surfaces of the cells, and it gives it sort of a matte finish. This Weissia, maybe it's pronounced Weissia, is amazing. It grows during the winter, and the sporophytes are present in very, very, very early spring or late winter. One of the features about Weissia, maybe it's Weissia, is the leaves are curled up. Some moss leaves are curled down. Some moss leaves are curled up when they're dry, but Weissia leaves are curled up when wet or dry. And that's, it's something you can recognize in the field, to recognize the genus. This is another moss that grows on trees. I probably should have nestled it up against the Orthotrichum. It's very closely related to Orthotrichum. It's called Eulota. Eulota is, you can find it high on the bark of trees. Look for sporophytes that are a little bit more elevated. They got a bit of a stalk. And also, the leaves, when they're dry, are curly and crispy. That's why it's called Eulota crispa. Now it's called Eulota crispula. They changed the name for some reason. This is a moss that grows in wetlands, and it's light color, and it grows in dense patches. It's called Olecomnium palustre. It's ribbed bog moss, referring, I believe, to the longitudinal striations on the sporangia. Boy, look at those peristomes. Ooh, pretty. And ribbed bog moss is noteworthy for another reason. That other reason is it reproduces both sexually and asexually, abundantly. So this bog moss, these kind of look like sporophytes if you look at the bottom part. But then what's that on the top? What that on the top is clusters of asexual reproductive propagules called gemmi. So this moss reproduces both ways, and it produces both of these things fairly frequently, reminiscent of the situation with Tetraphis pellucida that Robin Kimmerer studied, the moss that grows on stumps that we read about, where we saw some differences in the types of reproductive propagules that are formed when the mosses are crowded or not. Let's look at another category. These leaf shapes are not crisp, hard, and fast, strictly defined. They freely intergrade, and it's sort of a matter of judgment and sometimes a matter of confusion to say if something is lance-shaped versus needle-shaped versus ovate versus tongue-shaped. But I found a few that I think are tongue-shaped. And let's look at them. This is one called Olecomnium heterosticum. And it grows typically on rocks. It often grows with that apple moss, that Bartramia pomiformis. They seem to be friends. It has longer, narrower sporophytes than the apple moss and broader, tongue-shaped leaves. Another moss with moderately tongue-shaped leaves is called Plagionium ciliare. This is a moss that's distinguished by having teeth along the margin of the leaf. There's a closely related species with broader leaves, which is why it's not in this particular little compartment, that has leaf teeth only in the upper part of the leaf. This one has leaf teeth all the way along the margin. It's called Plagionium ciliare. This is a close-up of Plagionium ciliare, and it shows a feature that some mosses have, that in order to effect the dispersal of sperm better, environmental water is needed to effect sexual reproduction in non-seed plants. The male plants have their leaves formed into like a splash cup. So that's a male stem right there in the middle. Acrocarps with ovate leaves. This is a big category. And I picked a few. And they are coming up. Let's take a look at them. Here's one of my faves. And this doesn't show the leaves, but oh my gosh, these sporophytes are incredible. This is called Funaria hygrometrica. It's the water measuring cord moss. And the reason it's called that is that these seta, they twist and move a little bit in relation to moisture. It's not like they're going to whip around like, oh my God, what's going on over there? But it's enough to change the orientation of the sporangia and to sort of enhance the dispersal, the protracted release of the spores. And it's a very common moss. It's cosmopolitan in distribution and tends to occur on fire pits. I found this one where there was a campfire. This is the base of the plants. Now this is young before the sporophytes emerge, but it shows really nicely how the leaves are shaped in that funaria. They're broad. They're kind of ovate, sort of egg-shaped in cross-section would be. Widest at or near the base and gradually coming to a tip. These leaves form a sort of bud-like rosette at the base of the plant. And these are the sporophytes of so-called cord moss when they're ripe and releasing spores. They have this asymmetric appearance. They're kind of neat. A very, 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 very common moss, perhaps the most common in Ohio, is called baby tooth moss. What's that about? Plagionium cuspidatum. And yeah, its leaves kind of look like cherry leaves. Here's a picture on the right. This is the one I was referring to before that has the leaves that are not toothed at the base, but they are toothed near the tip and halfway up to the tip. And I like the way these leaves are. They kind of remind me of cherry leaves, and they just remind me that mosses aren't so hard to identify. It's just that they're small. And if this was the size of, like, say, a cherry tree, you could tell it apart. These are the sporangia. This is a peristome with two circles of teeth. An outer one called an exostome and an inner one called an endostome. And they change their orientation in response to humidity, also modulating, regulating the dispersal of spores. Ooh, Tetraphis. Tetraphis is the one that Robin Kimmerer did research on, and it's typically found on stumps, very well decayed stumps. It has a substrate affinity to the stumps, and here it is on a stump, and it reproduces two ways also. This is Sporophytes, which, by the way, true to the name, tetraphys, tetra means four, it has 4 teeth. The peristome is a very unique peristome of 4 very thick teeth, and that's it's taxonomically separate from most other mosses. Another way it reproduces, look on the left, these are gemmy. So it reproduces asexually by these little bird's nests, and the eggs in the bird's nest are the gemmy that can form new plants. Tetraphys. Let's go look at a tree again. High in the bark of trees. These two often occur together, but the one I direct your attention to is not this one here with the sporophytes. It's the one that's got these little granular dots all over the upper surface, or clustered toward the costa on the upper surface of the leaves. This is Centrichia papillosa, and it is not known to produce sporophytes anywhere in North America. It only reproduces asexually, but by the means of these little granular gemmy that it produces on the upper surfaces of the leaves. And it's pretty common on trees. It looks really, really different dry. I'm sorry I don't have a picture. It looks black and sort of spindly, spiky. And when it's moist, it looks beautiful like roses. Often growing with it is that orthotrichum that we saw before, that bristle moss. Very similar sort of overall aspect in terms of the leaves, but totally different way of reproducing. Interesting. Here's a moss called silvery Ibrahim. It's Ibrahim argenteum. Argenteum means silvery. And the reason it looks silvery is that the leaf cells at the upper part of the leaf, they're clear. They don't have any chlorophyll in them. And it gives this moss a peculiar whitish appearance. So here's a group of mosses that's one of the ones I called like the weird ones. When I say weird, I mean that most mosses are like what we've seen so far. Leaves that are single cell thick, in most cases, spirally arranged, and that's kind of the common pattern. There is a few genera, primarily Physidins, but a couple of others, that have leaves that are actually strictly two-ranked. One side of the stem, the other side of the stem, flat as a pancake, not spiral at all, and they're cool. They're easy to recognize. So there's this genus called Physidins, and which is a fairly common and widespread genus, and most of our flat mosses will be Physidins. But Bryophysium is really cool, and we saw it at Deep Woods in Hocking County, and it's kind of globally uncommon, but it's abundant where it's found, and it's found in Ohio in the southern part. So let's take a look at some of our flat friends. Physidins. Physidins is called pocket moss. So it's here you can see it's flat. Not only is it flat, though, here's another instance. Not only is it flat, though, but the leaves are split at their base. So here's the base of a leaf, and it's split. And the next leaf above, this is like the top of the plant is over here on the right. And the next leaf above sort of fits it into a little pocket that's formed by that split. It's sometimes called equitant, like from equestrian, meaning like horses and stuff. The way that a rider's legs clasp a horse, this flap of split leaf clasps the next leaf above. Iris flower leaves are kind of like that. So here's a couple of flat friends in the grotto. Here's one species of that Physidins, and with it is this one called Bryophysium. It's called the sword moss, and it's that one that's kind of rare. Pleurocarps. Let's talk about pleurocarps when I learn how to be able to talk again. So coming up soon, pleurocarps. Pleurocarps. Can you say pleurocarps?